So today here on the Fisher Revolution, we're going to talk about cross-processing film. So first off, what is cross-processing? Well, basically, it's where you process a film in a developer it was never intended to be processed in. So the classic example that most people are aware of is processing E6 film, transparency film, slide film in color negative developer. And what you get is a hypersaturation. You get an increase in color. You get an increase in contrast. And you get a lot of saturation, like just saturation that's just primary, that's just amazing. It's a look that a lot of people like. So where did cross-process come from? I don't know. My suspicion is somebody made a mistake in the lab at some point and cross-process was born out of that. It's an amazing look. It's one that I've used very successfully for a lot of my pinhole work, for some work with a Loma LCA. And as requested, I will show lots of examples in this video on cross-processing and how it looks. So how do you expose film for cross-process? Well, I always recommend underexposing the film, whatever the box speed is, by one stop. So generally speaking, when I'm shooting a film like say Ektachrome E100, I rate it at 200 for almost everything. Now, can I get away with 100? Sure, absolutely. But I'll have a better negative that's easier to scan if I shoot it at 200. The reason is you get an increased density as a result of the cross process. And if you don't underexpose at least a little bit, depending on the scanning solution you're using, you're risking the inability to get really great highlights. You're risking blowing everything out. Having now said that, there are an awful lot of times that I'll shoot E100 at 50 or 100 cross process for a particular look where maybe I do want to blow out the highlights. I don't want to retain any of that detail. It really depends on what you want. But if you're going for just a basic, recommendation on exposure, always underexpose by one stop. Another question that I know people are going to ask is, should you have a lab process your film or should you do the film at home? I prefer to do it in-house. I have a lot more control. If I want to increase or decrease the developer to add a little more contrast or pull the film back again, I can. If I want to do a little bit of a bleach bypass, I can. These are conversations that we'll have in future posts, but I always advocate doing it yourself. Additionally, it's a lot cheaper to process your own C41 cross process at home, and you're totally in control of that process. That to me is invaluable. So I highly recommend, if you've got sort of the mindset to sort of process your own film, give it a shot. It's not that hard. And one thing to remember, because we're cross-processing the film, and because you're not going for precise, perfect color accuracy, because that's not the point of cross-process anyways, if you're off by just a little tiny bit in your developer temp, it's not going to matter. It's not like processing E6 where you're going for perfect neutral highlights. We're not going for the precision of like E6 where you want perfectly clean highlights, or C41 where you're really trying to keep that line perfectly tight. In this case, with cross-process, we're going for a more expressive, a more artistic color palette, a more artistic contrast. You're not going for reality. You're going for something that's more artful. So being off a little tiny bit doesn't really matter. And in some cases, it actually kind of adds to the process. So cross-process is fun. You can control it, but there's variability within the process. And I kind of like that. It's only so much control. So let's talk a little bit about film selection. As I mentioned before, there's not as many transparency films available as there was back in the 2000s, the early 2000s, that is to say. My favorite films were always Agfa Precisa CT. It's long gone. Fuji 400X was a bread and butter film for me. I loved everything about that film. It had great reciprocity characteristics. When you cross-processed, you had beautiful color, beautiful saturation. Yet Fuji fucking discontinued the film. It's one of my favorite films, and I'm still mad at Fuji for that, by the way. I've not forgiven you. That film was amazing. However, good part is that Kodak brought back Ektachrome E100. E100 is a great film for cross-process when you don't want a really funky, crazy color cast, but you want contrast, saturation, and that pop that cross-process brings out. So in recent months, I've started doing this process again. I stopped doing a lot of the artwork that I make that was done using cross-process back around 2014. And the reason is the materials weren't available. But now that Ektachrome E100 is back, I've started making pinhole cross-process work again. I'm really having a lot of fun. And the only reason I can do it is that E100's back. I know you can cross-process Fuji Velvia. I know you can cross-process Fuji Provia. They've gotten unbelievably expensive, When I go on like B&H's website, I cannot believe how much money the Fuji transparency film is costing. Don't get me wrong, the Kodak stuff is not cheap, but compared to what Fuji's charging, it's shocking. And again, I'm still mad at Fuji, so I'm not gonna give them any of my business. But one thing to know about E100 is that it seems to be especially sensitive to color temperature when you cross-process. Like, I was kind of surprised in some of the examples that I'll post. The blues, when it was an overcast day, are unbelievable. Like, just absolutely deep, rich blues. And so if you're working in a lot of mixed lighting, this is a cool thing, realize that that's really gonna show up in the cross-process. You know, incandescent lights in a room are really gonna pop. You know, cool blue areas of shadows are gonna be really blue. It seems to me to be more pronounced than it used to be with 400X, and I, for one, am totally fine with that. So just be aware that the color temperature of the light that you're photographing in will have a radical effect on the actual color balance and look of the images that you're creating. I'd like to now pause for a second and say, can you help support the Fidget Revolution? On patreon.com/Fidget Revolution, you can make a small contribution to help support this channel and help support the content that I create. I've been writing this channel since 2006. It's always been free. It's always been advertiser and sponsor free. So what you're hearing here is always my thoughts and my thoughts alone, and they're not being influenced by some third party. And that's the way it will always be. So if you can afford to make a small donation, basically the cost of a cup of coffee, if you can make that donation, it would be great and it'll help what I do here. And if you can't, don't worry about it. Someone else will make that donation for you. As I said, this content will always be free and advertiser and sponsor free. So in conclusion, the most important thing about cross-processing that I'd like to pass along is to have fun. It's a process that has control, but only so much. And it's important that you sort of allow that creative side to become part of that process. Embrace the imperfections of it. Embrace the color shifts. Embrace the contrast and the grain. If you like the look of the images that I've posted here as part of this video, those were all made in Agfa Precisa CT, Fuji 400X, or Ektachrome E100. None of those films had a really heavy color cast, and it's why I actually like them. If you want a color cast, you want some crazy funky color cast, try Velvia, try Provia. Those are going to give you that. If you're looking for something a little more neutral but with that extra punch, try the E100. But most importantly, have fun and experiment. As I always say, experimentation is key, and in this case, it's so important to discover exactly what look you want in your work.